Hi, welcome to the LaRouche PAC Weekly Report for January the 12th, 2011. I'm John Hopeful, and with me today in the studio are Jeff Steinberg and Lyndon LaRouche. Well, Lynn, welcome back from Europe.
Good to be back, but it's also nice to be in Europe. I have certain interests in Europe. Right. I think the thing which is important to illuminate is that we have entered into a period where between now and the 22nd of this month, I shall be producing, as I indicated yesterday, a statement, a State of the Union statement. And the peculiarity of this will be, because it's always my delight to realize what's wrong with what other people do who are too pompous about their affairs, is that my view is that the whole process, which has to be given as a report to the people of our nation and to others, is a coherent view of what the state of the universe, the state of the planet now, rather than a collection of pieces of different subjects. You have different subjects, but the important thing is that the process itself is not composed of individual types of actions, each separate from one the other, sort of accidentally colliding. But any competent understanding of a process is able to show that the whole picture is coherent, that there's not one thing bumping into another thing. For example, let's take the case of this kid, this psychotic. Now, the key thing about this fellow, which is absolutely clear so far, many things are perhaps mysterious, but the thing that's clear and is coherent is that he belongs to a generation, or we call it a degeneration, of his age group and category, which is characteristic of the state of the United States and to some degree the world today. I mean, he's a type, and there are many of them out there. They come in various flavors or disflavors or whatever you want to call them, but they're all defective. We have essentially a generation concentrated among a very large portion of people like this kid, between his age group, 22, he fits into this area of the 15 to 25 age group. And these people are highly defective. The reason they're defective is not because of some birth defect in them. There's a birth defect in the sense that they were born at the wrong time. But they are absolutely useless. They are a lost generation in the worst sense of lost generation. And there are many of them out there. It's loaded. He's not a unique feature. We've got plenty of them. We have a mass moment of terror out there with fellows like this. And when you look at them closely, it's very hard to distinguish between them, one to one, or among them as a group. This is a crucial part of what's wrong with our nation. What happened essentially was that the process of destruction of our culture, which was deliberate, which was organized from a combination of the outside and the Wall Street crowd, destroyed these people. They destroyed them how? Well, commuting. You have the family structure in the United States is broken. People commute long distances, at least one member of the adult member of the family. The relationships within the family are limited. The content between the children and the adults, the parents, is very limited in terms of productive contact. There is no family dinner table to speak of. There are no family hours. There's no family evening. So the family is not significant, and you have people retreat into a very strange kind of fantasy life. And what happens is then the whole mass of people interact with their kind of convergence on a certain kind of fantasy life. And there are lots of fellows just like this out there. We have the potentiality of a mass terrorism movement, which is comparable in some respects to an earlier generation, which was the high school mass assassination movement. A couple of young guys would come in with some weapons and shoot a lot of people, one or several people. And this was a phenomenon. We have a worse phenomenon in this guy. You don't know where the next problem is coming from because there's so many of them out there with a very similar behavioral problem. Now, the only way we're going to solve that aspect of the problem, which is a reflection of what's wrong with the nation, what's wrong with the transatlantic community, particularly as a whole, is you're going to have to ship them off to CCC camps or the equivalent. Get them away from their environment, totally out of their environment, with a work assignment, a development assignment, which is going to bring them back to some degree of civilization. We had a similar but less grievous problem coming into the 1930s with the Depression, where the CCCs saved a whole generation of young guys who were of this similar problem. But nothing like this. This is mass-induced. It's a product of the cultural degeneration of the United States. Our culture is degenerate. Yeah? And we have lots of these young fellows out there, and young girls, who are perfectly capable, unpredictably from the outside, and of exactly this. You can't predict it because there's so many of them out there. They're all like ready to go off. And these idiots in Washington don't understand that. So therefore, this comes to the post-industrial society. This comes to the Greenie movement, because all of these things are contrary to reality. So we force a younger generation, by negligence and by misdirection, into becoming of this type. And this is what's wrong. It's not there's a guy out there who's a criminal. It's not there's a guy out there who's a criminal who is of this type or that type may do this. You've got generally a section of an entire generation which has similar types. And young fellows of that generation will say to you, yes, I'm like that too. You better watch out. I'm like that too. I can't do anything about it. I'm like that. A lot of us are like that. But that was produced by a cultural process which begins in the immediate post-war period, as officially in 1950, with the Congress for Cultural Freedom in Europe. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a so-called CIA operation of what a certain branch of the CIA. You know, the intelligence community was broken into two parts during World War II. One part were the human beings, the other part were the guys who wore white tennis shoes or white buff boots. The Wall Street crowd. And the Wall Street crowd and its attachments were essentially fascists. And they set up in Europe the Congress for Cultural Freedom. These were the people who were responsible for this. And they have become prominent. It's the Wall Street ideology today. And this Wall Street ideology has had an effect on the population, which has produced among these generations this kind of object. Now, what I'm going to have to do on this is, among other things, is warning people. This guy was predictable because we know some facts about his predictability now through rather general research. But he's not predictable in another sense. His generation is predictable. And there are a lot of them out there. And the facts that have come out about him simply reveal that. But at the same time, look at what's happened. We have now and it's related to this, we have a policy in the United States called the Green Policy. It has taken the copy of Adolf Hitler's death camp policy. The United States, led by its president, current president, is committed to exactly the same policy that Adolf Hitler introduced in 1939 as his T group operation. The same organization, through the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, set up what he called the NICE operation. And what is happening in the United States, what the current president of the United States is doing, is identical with what Hitler did in 1939. But it's also identical with what Tony Blair represented with the same kind of program of genocide, of mass killing in England. And it was actually directly from London and from the Tony Blair circles, from that part of it, that brought this phenomenon of the Hitler phenomenon in the United States. And you will get officials, people supposedly sane in the United States, denying the fact that the present policy of the President of the United States and many of his accomplices is identical with that of Adolf Hitler. It's identical with the policy of which we executed doctors in Germany in the Nuremberg proceedings. And so therefore, on this one hand, you have the kid, who is a reflection of a sickness in a society, which on the other hand is represented by a mentally ill, corrupt, and evil president. And then we're in a situation where if we don't get this president out under, Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, because he is clinically insane, just like Nero, and someone like Hitler, or like others of that same time. And it's a coherent problem. We have no production. We don't believe in production. We believe in going backwards. We believe in population reduction. We believe in killing people, just like Hitler did. And so therefore, we have to look at this situation we're in now as a disease of our culture, a disease of the nation, a disease especially of the transatlantic English-speaking community, a disease of the European civilization in particular, a transatlantic disease. And we have to cure ourselves of this disease. We've reached the point that if we don't dump this president, who is just like Hitler and Nero in terms of his psychology, if you don't get him out, and we have the law to get him out, no question about it, no information, he is worse than Nixon, but he's comparable to Nixon as a national phenomenon. We produced Nixon in the post-war period. If we don't recognize that this president has to be removed now or somewhere soon, the United States is going to disappear. And the intention of the British in deploying this guy, this president, Obama, as a puppet of the British interests, is to use him as a tool to destroy the United States. And we sit here, and people, politicians, oh, you can't say that. That's over the top. Here he is. He's doing exactly what Hitler did in 1939. Exactly the crime for which we hung doctors, German doctors, in the Nuremberg proceeding. The same thing that is being done by Tony Blair and his crowd in England. The same thing that's here with the healthcare policy of this president, which is a Hitler healthcare policy. And you have a population that says, you can't say that. That's over the top. You can't say that. I can't put up with that. What's the difference between them and Hitler? What's the difference between them and the Hitler sympathizers? You got a bunch of Hitler sympathizers out there. Not because they like Adolf Hitler, because they say we can do it better. We're more experienced than Hitler. We can do the thing much more successfully and on a broader basis. And that's what we're facing.
Well, you can see the way in which they're pushing austerity on the states, that we have this enormous operation, bailout operation, to save the value of all of these fictitious assets. And we're destroying our state and local governments. We're destroying any semblance of production. We're destroying everything that human life depends on in this country. Everything we depend on to survive, in the name of saving all of this money, the value of the money. And at the same time, the very policy of printing more money in order to try to save the money is destroying the value of that money. So it's absolutely insane. We're destroying ourselves, we're disintegrating in order to maintain this illusion.
You do have the adolescent illusion of Ben Bernanke, that he thinks he owns Boardwalk. And he's issuing play money. and trying to control the real economy, the real life boardwalks, by this kind of operation. The key, what is going to shock people, they're just blocking on it. If we're going to save the United States and save civilization, we are going to cancel virtually all of these trillions of dollars which Bernanke and company are floating out there. We're going to have to. It's play money. It's not real. There's nothing there. But it's playing the game of monopoly on Boardwalk, investing in Boardwalk. And everybody's outbidding everybody else on Boardwalk. And Boardwalk is only a papier-mâché thing.
Like Wall Street.
Exactly. So but what that means is that if we're going to save the United States, simply by implementing Glass-Steagall, as President Roosevelt called it into play in 1933, we are going to wipe out Wall Street. We're going to wipe out many of the financial speculative centers of the world. And very simply, we say, well, you are not certifiable according to our Constitution. Therefore, your money is play money. You guys who play with this play money can do as you like in your private Wall Street type of operation. But we in the federal government, we of the United States, have no obligation to bail you out. The argument from Wall Street and from London is, but you got to abandon our banks. They're not our banks. They're banks that think they own us. We don't own those banks. They think they own us. They're killing our people. They're starving our people. They're destroying our nation. They're producing side effects of what their policy is. You see in this kid, same thing. So what the problem is, you have a force of people who are frightened of the power of international finance, especially the Anglo-American side of this thing. And they will do anything to say, you can't touch that. You can't touch that. That's sacred. That's our system. You can talk about the Constitution, but you got to keep the preamble out of this. Keep the preamble out. The guys are insane. And we're either going to go down to hell as a nation, a transatlantic community, and then the world, in fairly short order. In what week, I don't know. In what exact month, I don't know. But I can tell you we're well on the road now, first of all, to a total breakdown, collapse of the U.S. and European systems, right now. It's already there. It's just a question of when. But the when is getting closer and closer. It's converging on some date. In the meantime, we found that because we built up this system, which we built up by really beginning with Truman, step by step by step. And go back to the history of that. This is really the Hitler question. In other words, it was not a question that somebody brought Hitler into power in 1933 in Germany, or even that Hitler was launched as a British-sponsored project in 1923, or that Hitler was backed by the New York Times in the 1920s. This is not the point. This is a process of a corruption from the British Empire, which, well, let me review this, because I think it's important to clarify exactly what this is. Our system of government was actually established in Massachusetts during the period of the 17th century of the Massachusetts Bay Company, while it was still had a royal charter of sovereignty. We established then, as in no other part of the world, we established in those years, in Massachusetts, we established the foundation of a new conception of economy located in what became the United States. And the root of this was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, the rest of the world, generally, of Europe, was controlled by a monetarist system, which is actually an imperial system, which happened to be in its most recent incarnation, British. But the British system is an extension of a Venetian system before it, which was the new Venetian party of William of Orange, which was an extension of what had already existed in the Venetian policy. It was an extension of the Roman Empire, from Rome through Byzantium, through the shift to the Venetian system, which controlled Europe, feudal Europe, and then into the Renaissance, and then the defeat of the Renaissance, which got us back into another crisis, religious warfare from 1492 to 1648. We came out of that, and it was during that period, the period of the early 17th century, that we finally succeeded in planting the legacy of the Renaissance in the United States, or what became the United States, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That idea, here was Franklin. Franklin was a protege of the Winthrops and Mathers. And Cotton Mather told him, get out of here. Massachusetts has been taken over by your evil friends in Britain. And he went down to Pennsylvania. And he set up an operation in Pennsylvania with guidance and backing from people in Europe, England, and elsewhere, to revive the policy which had been represented by the Massachusetts Bay Colony while it was still operating under its original charter. And that's the United States. The other aspect of it was the genius of Hamilton, who understood. Remember, Hamilton had a group of banks in the United States, of state banks, of what had been the colonies. They were all bankrupt. The United States, which had been successfully established with help from Europe, was now doomed. So Hamilton intervened and said, we're going to create a credit system based on a national credit system. But to do that, we've got to replace this collection of states as a confederation. We've got to integrate it under a national banking system. And we will create state credit of the nation as the means for our financial operations. It was a genius, and it worked. Our Constitution, including the preamble, including every other part that was established then, was based essentially on Hamilton's design for national banking. It's from that the Glass-Steagall Act was introduced in 1933 by Roosevelt, a continuation of the same thing of the greenback policy of Abraham Lincoln. Same thing, repeatedly, again. So it's our system. What we have, therefore, is we have a British system which controls all of Eurasia and Africa. The British Empire controls every part of it, especially with the introduction of the euro. And we, in the United States, are the bastion of defeat of that empire. What has happened is the empire, which is represented by the Massachusetts clowns in banking, and the New York clowns and the Chicago clowns in banking, don't belong to us. They're an alien element in our society. This alien element has now got a puppet in there, which they own. It's Obama. He's nothing but a British puppet. And this puppet's function, under his masters, as British masters, is to accomplish the destruction of the United States, to complete the destruction of the United States. Now, we don't believe in shooting the bomb. We like to have him suffer looking in the mirror. But we've got to get rid of him because he is an enemy of our nation. He's a puppet of a foreign power, in fact. And his policies are those of Adolf Hitler in economics and in healthcare. His policies are exactly those of the Emperor Nero. His policies are those of Adolf Hitler. And even worse, his policies are those of Tony Blair, who happens to be a personal enemy of mine. And he's an enemy because he's a no-goodnik. So that's the situation. Are we a nation? Do we have the guts to challenge this imperial power, to defend our Constitution, to defend our nation? Because if we don't do that, what those bums have done to youth like this kid this psychotic, brain-damaged kid, a whole generation like that. They've done that to us, not him. He's not the criminal. He's the instrument of the crime. They destroyed him. And he does these things he does. And that's what we have to see. We have to understand that if you don't say, get Obama out, if you say that saying he's like Hitler is over the top, you're a liar. You either have to prove you're insane or we have to call you a liar. It's not over the top. It's the truth. And those who do not accept the truth, what we're warning people of, are traitors to the United States and will be so viewed in the future. Every person who says this is over the top will become hated in the future of the United States because smart people here will wake up to the fact this is what was done to us and by whom. We've got to get this guy out of there while we still have a nation.
Lynn, just to emphasize the point of the immediacy of this crisis, this week 40 out of 50 states have convened their state legislatures, and every single one of them is facing an absolutely impossible situation where they're being forced to impose murderous conditions on their populations, state by state by state. And Obama is refusing to take the measures which under our Constitution are urgently required. Now, you, in our discussion yesterday, laid out a number of things that must be done. Step one, the unavoidable step being the immediate removal of Obama. You've mentioned Glass-Steagall, but there's a couple of other crucial elements that I think need to be presented to kind of round out your State of the Union and what needs to be done about it.
Well, I laid out what a unified package yesterday, which I will amplify in various occasions between now and the 22nd of this month. It's one unified package, but you can, the interaction contains a lot of elements which have to be discussed. And what it comes in is you take this package I laid out yesterday, which I designed, and then you go to each person, or each group of persons, or each type of person, and he's going to say to you, well, where am I in your picture? Mm-hmm. And I think I can confidently, in principle, reply to every one of these questions. Yeah. That, what's the meaning of my life, for example, is a big important thing for them. I didn't quite say that, but it's there. Right. That our nation, with its imperfections, admittedly, but relative to any part of the world, was a concept which was created as the alternative to European imperialism. Europe today is still run by imperialism. That is, you have a group of nation states called kingdoms in the former times, mm-hmm. and they're run by an empire. The empire is organized not on nation-state basis, it's organized on the basis of money, a money system. So an international money system is the core, the glue that holds together an empire. Now, since the formation of the Roman Empire, under what became Caesar Augustus, which was negotiated between the Persian end, the cult of Mithra, and the Romans as such on the Isle of Capri. Mm-hmm. And the Egyptians were called in, with their cult, were called in, and this made the Roman Empire. But this empire was based on the idea of monetarism. Monetarism, which in this form, as a maritime culture of monetarism, was established in ancient Greece. Well, this is what the whole problem was there. So the monetarist system, which was based on a maritime system, the ruling class of Europe from the time of the Peloponnesian War up until the present time in Europe has been an imperialism which is based on monetarism. Now, whoever controls the monetary system as a supranational monetary system, like a World Bank mm-hmm. and similar kinds of institutions, actually controls, as we see with the euro today, the British are sitting outside the euro, controlling everybody in continental Europe, including the Russians, right. who are controlled by the bric-a-brac, which is bankrupt.
Right.
So every part of Europe is controlled by a monetarist system, including the Russian government, which is a puppet of the British system, the British monetarist system. And so therefore, European culture is based on the dependency on money, that life is controlled by those who control money, who control the monetary system, control the lives, the destinies, the purposes of people. That's imperialism. We in the United States have a constitutional system. For the Glass-Steagall case, for example, recently, in the period before the last election, there were a strong, and there's still a majority support for Glass-Steagall inside the ranks of the U.S. political system. But the British government sent a threat to the Obama government saying that that if the United States were to reenact Glass-Steagall, this would be considered by the British as a virtual act of war. So the puppet president, Obama, who's nothing but a British stooge, British puppet, said no. And the others went along with this stupid puppet. Because the banks of New York, which are nothing but an extension of this thing, those New York banks and the Boston banks and the Chicago mob are all part of this thing. They, with their money interests, their monetarist interests, and what is the monetarist interest? It's nothing. It's paper. You could take $15 trillion of the U.S. debt today, throw it away. Glass-Steagall would do that. Glass-Steagall might destroy $20 trillion of this crap because it has no value under our Constitution if we enforce. That's what the issue is. And then you look at the minds of people and say, oh, you got to defend, we got to bail out, we got to bail out, we got to do this, we got to do this. Look at the people who say that, leading politicians. Right. Why are they zombies? Are they zombies? They must be. If they think this is in the interest of, no, they're afraid. Well, I depend upon my bank. My bank is controlled by this. And therefore, you cannot threaten my bank. Besides, I would lose my job. My firm would be shut down. Mm-hmm. Terrible things would happen to me if we didn't defend this bank. But this bank is going to kill us, this banking system. And so therefore what's happened is the United States has been taken over again and again and again, and we fought back again and again and again against this British imperialist system. And what we are is the victims of British imperialism. And British imperialism is not British. The system was originally established in this form as an imperial system in the Isle of Capri by negotiation between the later Caesar Augustus and the cult of Mithra, with agreement with the Egyptian cults. This was the cons. Since that time, European civilization, first within the Mediterranean maritime area, then expanded about 1000 AD with the Norman conquest of England. They established it as what became an Atlantic as well as a Mediterranean empire. And so we in the United States came to what became the United States to take the best of European civilization then, especially English and Dutch at that time, to what became the United States, to establish a republic which represented European civilization, or European civilizations as such, but free, separated by the Atlantic Ocean from that nonsense that was going on in Europe. So we are essentially, now today, Chinese and so forth, are the culture in here. But originally, we were European culture in its best expression, as typified by the influence of Cardinal Nix of Cusa. We've remained that, but we've had to defend it against the imperial forces of Britain. Now, Roman, the Byzantium, the Venetian tyranny of the period that collapsed, and so forth. And now the British Empire. And the British Empire is nothing but a continuation of the Roman Empire in that sense. Therefore, that's what the issue is. We have to have the guts to understand what the fight has been since before the birth of the Roman Empire, where monetarism has ruled European civilization since the emergence of the Roman Empire. And we, the United States, represent the principle of taking the best of European civilization from different language, cultures, and so forth, bringing it together on our nation as an alternative to imperialism. And the British imperialists are running the world today. And we have traitors to the United States, including the President of the United States, who is essentially a traitor to the United States. And we're keeping him in there because they're afraid of British bankers. And all these kinds of problems we have to be understood from a central principle. It's not this plus this plus this. It's the conception of the nature of man and the conception of the nature of government. We have in the United States, we established, beginning with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in its period as under charter, we created a new form of government in the world, contrary to the decadence of Europe. That's what the issue is. It's a concept. We represent a conception of man, that the human being represents value. The human individual represents value. In Europe, you have the desire for human beings to represent value. But the empire controls. And Europe is nothing but a collection of little kingdoms, all controlled by an empire, which today bears the name of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. The Inter-Alpha Group is the form of the British Empire. And the whole fight, the killing of our people with the healthcare policy, all these things are a reflection of this. It's one issue. Mm-hmm. And people have to come to understand it as one single issue. It's not a this and a that and a this and a that. It's all one conception. What is the conception of the nature of man? What's the nature of the individual? Mm-hmm. What's the nature of society that protects and defines that individual? That's what the issue is. It's the highest form of issue. It's not an issue. It's a question is, we're human beings. What the British represent is not human. It's a caricature of humanity. We don't hate the British. We just want them to become free of their pestilence they've inherited.
If you look at the bailout in the United States, what has been revealed about this, you can see that much of the money that we've spent has gone to bail out foreign banks. But scandalizing and say, okay, some of this money is going to foreign banks and that's wrong is actually missing the point. Because the point is, there are no American banks in this anymore. That all of these big U.S. banks that get all this money too are not American. They're British. It's part of this British system.
Also British.
Yeah. And this is dominating our country today. We're destroying our own people in order to continue to bail this thing out.
With my age, I have an advantage and a disadvantage. It all wrapped up in the same thing. Because of my experience, because of my success as an economist, I am in no way mystified by anything about economics. Most people are. And they come up with what they think is what they've been taught, that they've learned. And it's wrong. Most of our politicians really don't know what the devil they're doing. But they have an idea of what they may have learned, what they think their expertise is. But their expertise is wrong. My advantage is seeing this. It's like sitting on a catbird seat, as I say, and looking out at what's going on the ground around me. And I just happen to be better informed than most people are, partly because of age. And I didn't waste my age entirely. I did learn a few things. And therefore, I do understand these problems, probably the best of anyone right now. But the point is, my mission is, we in the United States represent the culmination of a struggle among Europeans especially to free mankind from horrible forms of culture and governments, which are all based on imperialist systems in which the greatest part of the population was degraded into virtual servitude and denied the right to be human beings. And for me, I understand that perfectly. And that's what we represent. That's what the United States represents in its founding. That's what the Massachusetts Bay Colony under the Winthrops and Mathers represented before the British took it away. And the British who took it away was what? William of Orange. What was William of Orange? Dutch, not exactly. He was Venetian. And people, it's a story I think people appreciate. What happened is when the Roman Empire as such collapsed, the wealthy families of Rome, the ruling families of Rome, skedaddled. And they went up to the Adriatic Sea in the swampy areas up there in the north of the Adriatic. And they used the fact that they were living in a mud flat in a swamp. It was very difficult to run mass military operations against them. So they ran a kind of little piracy system up there. Now this thing stumbled along from the fall of the Roman Empire in its original form into about 1000 AD. 1000 AD, this bunch of people up there had already begun to build up what became the city of Venice. Venice, up until about 800 BC, had not been a city. It was developed then as Venice began to arise out of the decay of Byzantium. And from that time on, from about 1000 AD on, signaled by the Norman conquest of England, this force took over, the Venetian force. That is, the Crusade thing was an operation of this type. The Crusades were operate to control a system, a European system, an imperial system. And so that continued. This, Habsburgs and so forth, then this system collapsed at the end of the 14th century. And out of that came the Renaissance, the birth of a modern conception of Europe, which occurred centered on the Florentine Renaissance, Nicholas of Cusa and so forth. This was then defeated by the resurgence of a new Venice. In the course of the 16th century, you had the old Venice had failed. They couldn't cope with the emergence of the kind of culture which the Renaissance had brought in. So therefore, Paolo Sarpi comes along and becomes the leader of the new Venice. And this takes over first England directly. But in the meantime, the funny part of it is this. So the old Venetians, the old Romans, who had fled to the area of the Northern Adriatic, had moved into a swamp. And from the security of these swampy areas, they were able to maintain a financial system, a Roman financial system. As they became powerful, they looked to the northern coast of Europe, where they found the Dutch, which was also a swamp. So what you had historically in the 14th century, you had the emergence of a Venice Dutch-based system, which became under Sarpi called the New Venice. Now the Dutch, what was called the Dutch kingdom, ruled by the burghers of there, was actually the northern office of the Venetian system. This happened to be the modern office of the Sarpi version of the system. So when William of Orange crossed the sea, the straits, to take over England, he wore a flag, and the flag was of the New Venice. So you have a continuity of what became England as an empire under William of Orange, a continuity of that with the British Empire today. The British Empire was actually set into motion with the mass killings of the Irish by William of Orange in that end of that century. And that's what we have today. That is the enemy. That's the enemy against which the struggle for the United States was based. And that's the history of European civilization. We and others fought to free mankind from this kind of imperial atrocity. And the British represent it today.
We should send them back to the swamps then.
The problem, they probably get a resurgence. They are swamp people, I think, by nature.
Let them crawl back into the lagoon.
We can certainly swamp them with Glass-Steagall.
We're going to call the Queen of Elizabeth, Mrs. Lagoon.
But I think if there's a central point that you've made here today, Lynn, it's that there is a state of war between the American system and this British imperial system, which right now dominates the entire planet. And I think the real measure of leadership, and getting back to this question of the true state of the Union, comes down to the fact that there are very, very few people, even among the best of the nominal political leaders of this country, who have any grasp that we are in this state of war and that we're at a critical moment in this war where the danger is that the United States could be ultimately defeated and destroyed.
We're already being destroyed.
Yes.
Our universities played a part in it. Now you have things within university systems which harbor actually a useful continuation of science and other things. I work with some of these people.
Right.
Enjoyed it. But overall, the educational system of the United States has, in my lifetime, has undergone a progressive degeneration, even in the course of my lifetime.
Right.
That, particularly the post-war period. What's generally the educational system is crap. It's a fraud. And that's part of the process. The very idea, or look, for example, the very organization of the classroom. It's on schedule. Now, the key function of education under our moral system is to find ways in which to gradually enable students to, through their creative faculties, to actually come to original internal insights. Not to how to learn how to do something, but to go through the experience of accepting a challenge, to learn how to think creatively and come through creative thinking to what they call knowledge. Today, what the tendency is to call this monkey training, training a monkey to do tricks. And our educational system is largely based, even in the engineering field, or has been, on teaching monkeys to do tricks. It's not, the purpose of education should be to provoke the person, the individual in the school system and in life, to go through an experience by which they come to discover themselves a principle which is the basis of what we can call their education. What we have now is monkey training. You learn this, you memorize this, you do this according to this standard, you do what you're told. So you actually have animal training, a circus monkey training. It's called education. And only a very small portion of the educated population actually has any creative development at all. And even those that have it is sometimes fragmentary. We have with the youth organization, we have a perfect demonstration of that. The fact is that to the degree that the process of discovery is a process of discovery of principle, it is not behavioral conditioning, which most mathematical education is behavioral conditioning. Mm-hmm. There's no principle involved whatsoever. So that's what the problem is. And if we're going to win this war, to save this nation, to save civilization, we're going to have to take this kind of problem into account. And my approach is with this package on the State of the Union is to take all these essential elements, condense them into featured elements, and hope that the adoption of that package will stimulate a process of self-development in the population. In the meantime, we can take on a few major projects, such as the NOAPA project, mm-hmm. which will be the opening for a renaissance in our republic and in the world.
And as you said, this has to be done as a coherent whole. You have to take the whole package. You can't view it as some sort of restaurant menu where you can pick this item and that item and, pick a few things and get anything done. That if we don't completely transform this whole system, starting with, with breaking the back of the brutish empire and breaking the back of this financial oligarchy and going to a credit system, that we're not going to make it. And there's nothing else that's going to happen. Nothing can be done to turn this country around if we don't do that.
I know, but that's why I get in this peculiar position where, I had gained a certain, repeatedly, especially since the 1970s, I've had surges in which I've become quite significant, not only in U.S. policy making circles, but also internationally. And of course, that's where my quarrel with the British interests comes up. the only way we're going to get out of this mess is that method. My experience is that you can educate and bring forth from in people self-development. And the problem is that when they begin to develop, they find that all kinds of things come in to disrupt them. Oh, you can't do that. Oh, you can't think that. You shouldn't say that. This kind of thing. Like all these brainwashed zombies who say that I'm over the top and condemning genocide. When genocide is going on, I'm condemning it. And they say you're over the top.
It's abrasive. It's
I mean,
abrasive
they're
to
all
denounce
becoming
genocide.
they're all becoming fellow travelers of genocide.
Right.
Fellow travelers of crimes against humanity, which they're voluntary participants. Voluntary by virtue of silent intimidation. They don't want to be caught saying what I say, because they might be attacked the way I get attacked. So that's the way life goes.
Well, there's a price to be paid for standing up on your
It's fun.
hind legs, and that price is that you enter a whole new world that's a lot more fun.
That's what I can say.
And you sleep well at night.
Not necessarily. I worry about people. I got a lot of people to worry about, including this. Some people want to hate this poor slug who did this attack.
Right.
But that's not the answer. Yes, he's a contemptible piece of wretched meat, but it's not entirely his fault, because he belongs to a whole generation of young people, now essentially somewhere between 15 to 22, 23, so forth, who are become degenerates. Well, they weren't born degenerates. They were born human beings. But what happened to them in this society produced degeneracy. They're not to be attacked and say, by eliminating them, we're going to solve the problem. We have to eliminate what made them the problem.
Yes.
And in the meantime, we've got to find programs which can salvage them, as we tried to do with the CCCs and a less grievous kind of problem back in the 1930s. And we saved the United States and civilization under Roosevelt with the help of the CCCs. For example, you had this operation in Michigan, and you had a fighting division, the Michigan Division, which came largely out of the CCCs, which became part of the auto industry factor later, and which helped us to win the war. So you can't knock these people as such. You have to say they're sick. They're morally sick, but they're human beings. So on the one hand, you must deplore what the process that produced this effect, which they represent, but at the same time, you've got to realize they're also victims. And their hatred against society, which this kid represented, is actually a flight from reality, out of hatred of society. Well, how did he come to hate society? Well, let's not take the case. I can only go so far with this case on the facts I know so far. But knowing on the generational basis, I know exactly what the problem is. He's a victim. Mm-hmm. He's a victim of this culture. He's a victim of the culture of the presidents we've had since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. We should never have gone into the war in Vietnam. And the only reason we got into the war because somebody killed Kennedy because he was objecting to the idea. That's how we got into the war. Kennedy was killed by Anglo-American interests because he was an opponent of that war. The purpose of that war was to destroy the United States. And if you know military history, you know that's the case. So we cannot try to blame some part of society, like the victims of society, who become degenerates. We have to recognize that represents a sickness which must be cured and must be treated as a sickness. But they are not the cause of our evil. Wall Street and what it represents is the cause of our evil.
To put the blame on this one individual, it takes it off of the rest of it. As a society, we take ourselves off the hook.
Well, they start a lynch mob. You control this. You watch the lynch mob type syndrome, which I saw in a sense. I didn't actually see a lynching, but I saw the lynch mob in the service, military service, and so forth. The way it operates is the victim the human offering, the human sacrifice of the victim becomes an affirmation of joint responsibility in a crime against humanity. Therefore, you now are committed to defend the crime. You defend what you did in the crime against the victim. So it's necessary to slaughter the victim to get the complicity of the participants, and therefore you control them by that.
We're back to defending Wall Street.
And you're back to defending Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned earlier the launching in 1950 of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which, to put it in very blunt terms, was a revival of Nazi culture.
Yeah.
You know, this character, Jared Lochner, who we're talking about in the Tucson shootings, I don't know that he ever read Heidegger, but his worldview and the universe in which that whole generation operates is exactly Heidegger's idea that there is no purpose in life. There is no mission for mankind. There is no divine spark in the individual for creativity and to make a contribution to civilization. It's all completely arbitrary, and everything that's been described about this kid by his so-called close friends defines a cultural outlook that you can trace directly back to the people like Heidegger, the Nazi culture that was brought back in with a vengeance through the Congress for Cultural Freedom during the Truman period.
One word for it, existentialism.
Yeah, yeah,
That's exactly it.
yeah.
Existentialism is the disease, the venereal disease of culture.
Right. And let's not forget that Heidegger, one of the leading existentialist philosophers, was a fanatical Nazi.
Yeah.
It's absolutely coherent with existentialist views.
And you have some other ones like,
Hannah Arendt is...
well, yeah, also. But not only that, you have the Joseph Schumpeter.
Right.
Schumpeter, who of Harvard, who gave us Larry Summers,
Right.
Another disease, case of mental disease, or moral disease.
Right.
And the characteristic of the Obama administration, if it's anything, is exactly that.
Right.
It's
Nietzschean.
creative destruction. Larry Summers and Schumpeter and company. These are the real Nazis.
Right. And from his perch at Harvard, Schumpeter was one of the leading enemies of Franklin Roosevelt and everything that Roosevelt did to revive the American system back in the 1930s. Not surprising in the least.
This is where the fascism in our culture is coming from, what's being pushed.
Yeah, sure. It's British.
Yeah.
All this stuff was British. It was the way, it was the British and the Habsburgs. They were combined as at 1812, 1815 in the Congress of Vienna. And that's when this system was set in motion. And these bastards used Napoleon Bonaparte as their toy. The British were you know, Napoleon was originally a poor slob, and he married Josephine, and Josephine was tied to this pro-Turkish element in France. So he tried a pro-Turkish operation in the Mediterranean, and the British kicked his ass. And he came whimpering back, and he divorced Josephine. I divorce you. And he married a Habsburg princess, that was the other side. And as a devotee of the Habsburg princess, he became a British Habsburg asset. And what he did is he ran a replica of what the British had done in the 7 Years' War. They ran a series of wars throughout Europe from the late 1880s, 1870s. They They ran this war under Napoleon throughout Europe to do the same thing that had been done to Europe in the 7 Years' War. So the British system has always used this kind of warfare, like the Vietnam warfare, as a way to destroy a target. Get a nation and its people involved in a war by which they destroy themselves for the advantage of the guy behind the scenes who's manipulating them. And that's what happened to the Indochina War. There was never a reason for going into a U.S. war in Indochina. Never. And Kennedy knew that, and Douglas MacArthur gave him detailed instruction on this thing. And MacArthur and Kennedy were determined they were not going to get the United States into a war in Indochina. It was a war in Indochina, which in the Indochina phase went on for approximately a decade. And the United States never returned from that war. How did they get the war going? They killed Kennedy. What happened? Why was this Oswald thing? Oh, that was cooked up by a bunch of people who organized this thing for the British. It's the kind of damn fools we've been.
And we have the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, this never-ending global war on terror. You know,
Sure, it's all orchestrated by London. The British Empire is determined to destroy the United States. The function and the motivation of the current President of the United States is to be a tool in destroying the United States once and for all. That's what this bastard represents. He doesn't even know what he represents. He's nothing but a tool, a particularly disgusting tool, but a tool nonetheless. If we don't get him out of there, we're not going to have a nation. If we don't get him out of there and we don't have a nation, you're not going to have a civilization.
Well, that sounds pretty straightforward.
Yes.
So I guess we ought to work on that.
We will work on it. I'll do that with this, continue this unified conception of this State of the Union issue.
Mm-hmm.
People have got to get not a list of things, gumdrops or something,
Right.
different flavors of
Jelly
gumdrops,
beans.
but rather a unified conception of what the government and constitution of our United States is, against the background of what is happening to it now.
I think in closing, it's important to just remind everybody that on January 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Lynn will be delivering an international webcast. It'll be broadcast live over this website. And this will be a State of the Union address. And 3 days later, President Obama will be delivering his State of the Union. And if anybody wanted evidence as to why this guy has to be removed from office in the immediate days and weeks ahead, I think juxtaposing what Lynn has to say on the 22nd with what Obama comes up with on the 25th ought to provide all of the evidence required. So,
Lynn will give a State of the Union and Obama will demonstrate his mental state. All right, well, that wraps it up for this week. Thank you, and we'll see you next week for the LaRouche PAC Weekly Report.